I want to break this down into 3 segments: Southern prejudice, Northern prejudice, and internal or subconscious prejudice. Um, Let me start with the definition of prejudice. And to me, those 2 definitions combined provide a pretty comprehensive description of what was going on in America, the racism that was going on in America. It was that combination of prejudice. We had 2 groups of people who did not know a lot about each other, and discrimination. 2 groups of human beings who are like in the fact that they're human beings, but there's this power play going on. And then from that, I'm going to move to segment number 1. First, the nature of prejudice in America. It was all about power. The world that Richard Wright lived in was controlled by white Americans, especially in the South, where it was not just economical and political. It was political, economical, and social discrimination. It was a constant, everyday way of life, the Jim Crow South. By controlling the economic, social, and political situations of blacks, whites were able to maintain power. And that is the crux. That is the nature, the basic background, the cause of the prejudice that was going on in America. White Americans felt the need to maintain control over the socioeconomic status and even the mental health, I would argue, of blacks in America in order to maintain an advantage. So in the Jim Crow Southern prejudice, there's a quote on page 184 that, on page 272, that I think perfectly describes the nature of prejudice in America. Richard Wright states, "Our too young and too new America, lusty because it is lonely, aggressive because it is afraid, insists upon seeing the world in terms of good and bad, the holy and the evil, the high and the low, the white and the black. Our Americans are frightened of fact, of history, of processes, of necessity. It hugs the easy way of damning those whom it cannot understand, of excluding those who look different, and it salves its conscience with a self-draped cloak of righteousness." So on page 184, Richard Wright describes a scene in which, as a very young man, he was having a hard time maintaining a job during the summer. And he desperately needed a job and couldn't understand why he couldn't seem to keep one. And so his friend tells him, "Dick, I'm treating you like a brother," he said. "You act around white people as if you didn't know that they were white, and they see it." To me, that perfectly describes why Richard Wright was having issues in the Jim Crow South. For some reason that I don't even understand, he was not able to acclimate himself into that paradigm of American thinking. White equals good, black equals bad. He was not able to acclimate himself to his assumed status as a Negro. He was not able to fulfill those traits that were expected of him, those roles, those functions that he was expected to fulfill. He was not able to fulfill them because he was too individualistic a person. He was too much of a free thinker, and that threatened white power in the Jim Crow South, and that is why he was constantly encountering friction in the Jim Crow South.
Did you ever sit thinking with 1,000 things on your mind? Did you ever sit thinking with 1,000 things on your mind? Thinking about someone who...
That brings us to Northern prejudice. When he moved to the northern part of America, he expected to be completely alleviated, or to be, maybe not completely, but to be significantly relieved of the racial discrimination. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I did notice that once he moved to the second half of the novel that dealt with his time in Chicago, he shifted the focus from racial discrimination to discrimination within the Communist Party that he found himself being a part of. And that discrimination was, that prejudice was against him as, first and foremost, a free thinker. He was way too independent and way too individualistic to be a part of the Communist Party. Secondly, because he was a writer, the writers, for some reason, in the Communist Party during Richard Wright's day were looked upon as frivolous, not as important as the hard hitters, as the militant activists. They were not seen. Their gift was not appreciated in the same light that other facets of that party were. So Richard Wright spent lots of time kind of talking about that, how that really bothered him. Lastly, I wanted to point out that Richard Wright, throughout the novel, throughout both parts, displays internal and subconscious prejudice against the people in his surroundings. He describes himself as an introverted person, and that may be why he was able to readily make generalizations about others, because he saw them as others. But there's this particular scene on page 272 when he was describing his relationship to the white waitresses that he worked with at a restaurant. He knew nothing personal about them. He had no outside dealings with them other than at work. But he makes this statement on page 272. It was in the deep psychological distance that separated the races that the deepest meaning of the problem of the Negro lay for me. For these poor, ignorant white girls to have understood my life would have meant nothing short of a vast revolution in theirs, and I was convinced that what they needed to make them complete and grown up in their living was the inclusion in their personalities of a knowledge of lives such as I had lived and suffered containedly. And to some, that may not be a prejudiced statement, but to me, he makes these kinds of sweeping generalizations about groups of people throughout the novel. His family, I do admit he was victimized, but he groups his family into this whole pool of these evildoers that are trying to force him to do things. He makes these sweeping generalizations about these white waitresses. He makes sweeping generalizations about members within the Communist Party without knowing all of them personally. He makes sweeping generalizations about American society, and I think that this also played a role. It's ironic that it's ironic that somebody who is so skilled at identifying prejudice all around him, he doesn't seem to see it within himself.
Did you ever sit thinking with 1,000 things on your mind? Did you ever sit thinking with 1,000 things on your mind?